You gave her everything and something in her eyes died, not out of cruelty, not even boredom, but something colder, quieter, like a shrine that collapsed under too many prayers. You remember the moment, don't you? Not in words, but in how her body stopped reaching, how her silence wasn't distant. It was full, finished, and now the same pattern returns, different faces, different names, but always the same rhythm. You give, and they vanish, not all at once, but piece by piece, as if your tenderness were water eroding stone. You think love is proof through sacrifice. But what if every gift you gave was a silent confession of your unworthiness to keep it? There is something sacred in the things withheld, the glance not given, the praise never spoken, the hunger that sharpens rather than soothes. But no one taught you that. They told you women want kindness, so why do they worship fire, but smother the warmth? Why do they ache for strength, but flee devotion? Why do they lean in, only to pull away? Come closer. Nietzsche never wrote a love letter, but he left you this warning hidden between the lines. You thought the altar would save you, that your endless offering of time, of patience, of softness would be the proof of your worth. You were told this is love to overextend, to anticipate her needs before she names them, to soothe her storms even when she brings the thunder. But the altar you built, stone by stone, out of apologies you didn't owe and sacrifices she never asked for, it didn't inspire reverence. It invited silence, and not the sacred kind. The kind that yawns wide between two strangers, pretending they still touch. You didn't notice the shift, not at first. It was gentle, like rot. She still smiled, still touched your hand, still answered your questions, but something had fled from her gaze, a wildness, a spark. The hunger that once made her eyes roam your body like territory, it vanished, and you thought maybe if I give more, she will return. Maybe if I kneel lower, she will love harder. But you forgot only gods are worshipped, and only what resists is sacred. You cannot be both the lamb and the altar. You cannot offer yourself and be desired in the same breath. She watched you bleed, not because she is cruel, but because cruelty was never required. You were bleeding already, and she simply witnessed what you did to yourself. In your desperate attempt to be needed, you became easy, and nothing in nature reveres the easy. The lioness does not chase the dying gazelle. The temple does not open for pilgrims who weep too quickly. You wanted to be loved for your softness, but she wanted to feel her own power reflected in your restraint. You never made her earn your gaze. You never made her doubt your presence. You were always there, always ready, always full of yes, and in the shadow of your abundance, she withered. There is a violence in overgiving, a quiet resentment that seeps into the gift. You think she can't feel it, but she does. The hidden expectation, the emotional invoice behind every gesture. You don't say it aloud, but your soul mutters it like a curse. I did this for you. Why won't you love me for it? That is not giving. That is bargaining dressed in silk. She doesn't hate you, she pities you. And pity is a graveyard where desire dies in silence. You made yourself her servant and expected her to treat you like a king. You gave her everything and now she has nothing to want. You cannot chase you because you are already caught. She cannot fantasize about you because there is nothing withheld. You gave her the conclusion and killed the story. You call it loyalty. She calls it suffocation. You call it love. But she can't feel herself when she's with you, only your need for her. She disappears beneath your affection, and that is the one place no woman wants to vanish. You will say, but I was good to her. as if goodness were currency, as if moral virtue stirs lust. But she was never aroused by your goodness, she was drawn to your power, to the part of you that could withhold and chose not to, until you no longer could. Until withholding wasn't a choice, it was impossible. You lost your edge, and with it, you lost her. Nietzsche once wrote that man is a rope stretched between beast and overman, but you hung yourself on that rope, hoping she'd cut you down and cradle the body. But she walked away instead, not because she didn't care, but because you were no longer climbing. You stopped ascending, stopped struggling toward yourself. You became soft, heavy, predictable, and in her bones, she knew no God dwells in what never resists. Even her cruelty was a gift, a test. When she withdrew, she wanted to see what you'd do. Would you rise? Would you roar? Would you disappear and make her miss you? Or would you chase her shadow through the fog like a boy chasing a kite made of smoke? You gave her your soul like it was a receipt. She doesn't want your soul. She wants your mystery. You told her everything, showed her everything. You confessed your wounds as if that would make her stay. But even the most maternal woman cannot love a man who demands to be mothered, especially not when he wraps his need in poetry and calls it romance. She wanted to feel small next to you, not responsible for your self-worth. But now she carries your tenderness like a burden and resents you for handing her the weight of your identity. She craves the unknown, the abyss behind your eyes, the chaos you tame, not the comfort you offer. She wants to walk beside danger, not carry it on her back. You thought love was service, but real love is war. Not a war against her, but a war against your own impulse to appease, to surrender, to become harmless in exchange for affection. You surrendered before you were asked. You submitted before she demanded. And now she has nothing left to fight for. She doesn't want peace, not that kind. She wants tension, the kind that stretches between two sovereigns, the kind that says, I don't need you, but I choose you anyway. And you never made a choice. You only begged to be chosen. That is the altar of excess where men burn their pride, their purpose, their poetry, all to keep the candle of her attention flickering for one more hour. And she senses it. Not in words, but in instinct. She smells the desperation in your praise. She sees the trembling in your hands when she pulls away. And she becomes the god, not because she wanted worship, but because you needed a deity to kneel before. You thought you were giving her love, but what you gave her was your spine, and she never asked for that. She needed to feel your absence, the cold echo of your footsteps walking away, to know your presence had value. She needed to doubt your affection, to desire it more. She needed to suffer your silence, to beg for your voice. And you were always there, always open, always weeping at her shrine. But women do not desire the man who waits at the temple gates. They crave the man who builds the temple, then vanishes into the mountains, leaving the scent of fire and the question, will he return? You never made her ask, and so she stopped waiting, stopped wondering, stopped wanting. The altar is in ruins now, not because she destroyed it, but because it was never built to last. You carved it out of need. She smelled the weakness in the incense. And now you sit in its ashes, wondering why the prayers went unanswered. But love is not a prayer, it is a jewel, and you dropped your sword before the first blow. She used to look at you like you were the flame. Now she looks through you, past you, into some absence you've become. You feel it not in words, but in her blink that lingers too long, her touch that delays half a second too late, her breath that shortens in your presence like she's suffocating under kindness she can't return. You offered your entire being, thinking her gaze would soften. Instead, it sharpened. What began as admiration turned into dissection. Not because she's cruel, but because your surrender tempted her to become something beyond even herself. When you knelt, you crowned her, and no woman forgets the moment she was made a god. You didn't mean to do it. You thought you were proving love. But she saw the shift. The man who once stood at the edge of his own abyss now curled at her feet. You gave her power not as a game, not as dance, but as truth. And the paradox began. For the moment she became your source of meaning, she began to hunger for yours. The more you gave, the more she starved. She was never meant to be worshipped. Not like that. No woman is. The pedestal corrodes her spirit. She may lean into it for a while, intoxicated by the scale of your adoration, but the higher you raise her, the more she loses herself in the thin air. And then she does what the soul always does. In panic, it devours what made it rise. Your devotion became too sweet, too easy, too ripe, and in her famine, she consumed you. You think you were being generous, but you forget generosity that comes from fear is just bribery with better manners. You feared her loss more than you feared your own erasure, so you softened, silenced, and smiled even as your own bones cracked beneath her needs. She noticed, and in that noticing, she grew resentful, not of your affection, but of your disappearance. You made yourself small to make her feel safe, but she didn't want safety. She wanted reality, and the reality is this love does not bloom where men kneel without pride. She tried, for a while, to believe you were still him, the one who once held her gaze like fire in his fist, but that fire dimmed. You stopped saying no. You stopped walking away. You stopped being mystery. And every woman, whether she admits it or not, aches for the man she cannot quite understand. You became too visible, too available, too explained, and she who once stared at you with awe now closes her eyes to remember what awe used to feel like. You think presence is loyalty, but loyalty without mystery is captivity. You were always there, always reachable, always saying yes, and the gaze that once longed to catch you began to drift not to other men, perhaps, but to the ghost of who you once were. She misses the version of you that wasn't afraid to vanish, the one who made her wonder, the one who didn't give answers, only questions. That man is dead. You killed him with comfort, and in your comfort, she was consumed. You thought her silence was confusion. It was digestion. The feminine does not want to consume you whole, not immediately. It wants to taste your resistance, to test your walls, to press its lips against your refusal and feel it soften just enough to let her in, but never more. You gave her a feast without hunger, and no matter how starved a woman seems, she cannot love what she didn't have to chase. She needs your fire, not the warmth, the flame, the part of you that burns even when she turns her back, the part of you that creates even in her absence, the part that would choose the mountain over her arms, not out of spite, but out of truth. She doesn't want to be your religion. She wants to kneel beside you in the cathedral you've built from your solitude. But you made her the cathedral, and now she can't breathe inside it. You thought loving her meant erasing yourself, but what you erased was the very thing she desired. Your edge, your roughness, your refusal to bend until you decided to, not because she asked, but because you chose. That's the difference. That's the seduction. That's what she stares into the man who bends the world, not the one who bows to it. Your fear made you generous, and your generosity made her starve. And now you wonder why her eyes no longer hold that heat, why her voice sounds like it's speaking through a veil, why her body turns away even as she says, "I love you." It is because love, for her, was never the feeling, it was the force. And when your force broke beneath her gaze, she swallowed it, and with it, her own desire. She devours not to destroy, but to survive. Because the moment you made her the center, she had no orbit left to follow. She spun in place, dizzy with power, longing for gravity. You gave her everything and robbed her of the man who once refused her, and in that refusal, she found her flame. You gave her the firewood, the flint, the matches, and then asked her to admire the ashes. She smiles, but not with her eyes. She touches you, but not with her soul. And every night, in the silence between her breath and yours, she remembers the man who would have made her wait. You never made her wait, and so she forgot the meaning of arrival. Nietzsche once said, "Invisible threads are the strongest ties." You made the threads too visible, too heavy, too predictable. You replaced mystery with devotion, power with proximity, danger with confession. And now she walks beside you as if you were her brother, familiar, kind, and unbearably safe. The gaze that once devoured you now flickers past. Not because you failed her, but because you erased yourself in the name of love. She never wanted a ghost in her bed. She wanted a god on his throne. But you left the throne to bring her flowers, and now neither of you knows where the king has gone. She wanted to orbit you, to feel her body pulled by something larger, something radiant, something untamed. Not a promise, not a vow, a force, a man she couldn't quite hold and for that reason would never let go. But you stood still and she moved on, not out of cruelty, but because you stopped moving, you stopped rising. You stopped being the sun and became a mirror reflecting her own light. No woman falls in love with her reflection, not for long. You think you were loving her deeply, but the truth is you were watching yourself vanish in her eyes and calling it romance. She doesn't despise you. She despises what you became to keep her. And now you lie beside her, more loyal than ever and more alone than you've ever been. She still devours you, not with touch, with silence, with absence, with the cruel mercy of staying just long enough to remind you what it felt like to once be desired. You fed her until she forgot how to hunger, and in that forgetting, she forgot how to love. You thought your purity would protect you, that your sincerity, your unwavering truthfulness, your devotion without violence would become the thing she clung to. You believed, like so many men taught by mothers, that if you were the lamb untouched by pride, uncorrupted by dominance, she would cradle you like something holy. But the lamb was never sacred to her. The lamb was dinner. What she hungered for was not your virtue, but your edge. And when she saw that you were incapable of cutting anything, not even yourself, her mouth closed, her stomach churned, her eyes wandered. You became the golden lamb, polished, soft, perfect, and utterly unworthy of fear. There is no reverence without fear. There is no longing without the risk of loss. And you were always there, smiling, hoping, handing her more of yourself even after she started dropping pieces on the floor. She stepped over your heart not because she meant to, but because you placed it at her feet like a gift and she never asked for it. You mistook your need for goodness, but it wasn't goodness. It was compliance. It was the animal instinct to be spared. And the cruel irony is this: the moment you seek to be spared, she loses the instinct to protect you. You were not her equal, you became her pet. And even the kindest woman tires of the pet that cannot bite. She does not want to raise you, she wants to rise with you, but the golden lamb cannot rise. It kneels, it pleads, it looks up at the hunter and calls this love. You think she betrayed you, but how can she betray what never stood tall? You collapsed before she struck. You bled before she scratched. You confessed before she even questioned. She saw you naked, and not once did you demand she disrobe in return. You made yourself harmless and called it strength. You made yourself available and called it loyalty. But what you really made was an altar to your own insecurity, hoping she would anoint you king in exchange for your willingness to kneel. But kings do not kneel. Not like that. You once had chaos. You once had silence that unnerved her. Now you have politeness, predictability, obedience. She is not leaving because you are bad. She is leaving because she cannot feel herself around you. And a woman who cannot feel herself cannot love. You tried to keep her by dissolving yourself, and in doing so, you made her vanish too, because when you disappear, you take the story with you, and she is nothing if not a creature of story. You gave her a fairy tale where the prince never dies, never doubts, never says no. But that is not a story, it's a coma. And she could feel the weight of it in her chest every time you reached for her with those pleading eyes. You wanted to be needed, but she wanted to be chosen. And there is a chasm between those two. You looked at her like salvation, but the moment you worship her, she becomes the priest. And what does the priest do to the golden lamb? He sacrifices it, not out of hatred, out of ritual, out of necessity, out of inevitability. The lamb must die so that the fire is lit, so that the altar has meaning, so that the story has blood. You were too clean, too pure, untouched by shadow, and so she had to invent darkness around you just to feel something. She picked fights, she pulled away, she flirted with danger, not because she wanted to hurt you, but because your softness numbed her. You mistook your innocence for virtue, but innocence is only holy when it survives the fall. Yours was never tested, yours was never earned. It was inherited, and she saw through it. She saw that you had never stood against yourself, that your goodness was the product of fear, not fire. She needed a man who had walked through hell and brought back the devil's grin, not the boy who trembles at the edge and calls it enlightenment. The golden lamb cannot love, it can only hope. And love is never born from hope. Love is born from tension, from risk, from the unbearable truth that you might be destroyed and choose it anyway. You removed all risk from her love. You made yourself a guarantee, and in doing so, you made her absence inevitable. She wanted to doubt you. She wanted to wonder where you were, who you'd become, whether your hands would still reach for hers after you returned from the dark. But you were always there, always present, always bleeding from a wound she never gave. And she began to wonder, what does he want from me that he cannot take for himself? And the answer terrified her validation. You didn't love her. You needed her gaze to prove that you were lovable, that you, golden lamb, had value in the eyes of something wild. But no woman respects the man who waits to be crowned. She only respects the one who forges the crown and dares her to wear it beside him or walk away forever. You think she abandoned you, but the truth is simpler. She exhausted herself trying to find the man inside the gift wrap. You were all gestures, all smiles, all soft edges and no structure. She searched for the door to your soul and found only windows. Wide open, blowing in the wind, inviting anyone to peek inside, but no mystery, no resistance, no lock to pick, no fire to steal. You made love into mercy, and she grew tired of being the one with the sword. Nietzsche said you must have chaos within you to give birth to a dancing star. But your stars were static, dead light from a dying sun. She could feel it when you spoke, how you paused to please, how you flinched at her moods, how your spine bent under the weight of her silence. She needed your defiance. She needed your storm, but you offered her a sanctuary with no gods inside. And now she has left. Or maybe not physically. Maybe she still texts, still lies beside you, still says, "I'm just tired." But her spirit is gone. Her eyes don't ask questions anymore. They only tolerate answers. The lamb has become invisible, and what is not seen is not loved. You do not hate her. You hate what you see in her absence. You see your own reflection, and it is weeping, not from heartbreak, from revelation. From the moment you realized she was never the one who took your power, you handed it over with both hands, wrapped in roses, tied with a bow made of every poem you wrote about becoming enough. But enough is not offered. It is claimed. It is held. It is carved into the soul through fire and distance and the unspeakable joy of being misunderstood but unbent. And you bent. She could not love the lamb who begged to be seen. She wanted the man who looked her in the eyes and dared her to look away first. She wanted the flame that burns even when no one watches. She wanted the God who laughs when the temple crumbles. But you were only ever the altar, somewhere in the woods. There is a man who once knew how to vanish. His footsteps leave no sound. His eyes hold no question. Women pass him like shadows. Some stop, some follow, but none stay for long. And he never asks them to. He does not offer himself. He does not withhold. He walks behind him. The lamb still bleats in the ruins of the altar, but no one listens now, not even the wind. And she, the one who once devoured you, dreams of a man with blood on his hands and silence in his heart. She wakes, gasping, and reaches for your side of the bed. It is warm, too warm. She turns away, and somewhere in the forest of becoming, the flame moves unseen, untouched, unfed but still burning.